Hello everyone, Dr. Joe Sweeney from IBRS here, and I really wish I could be with you in person today. The BIAP conferences are absolutely one of the highlights of my working life. I love attending them, I love being the master of ceremonies, I love presenting, but most importantly I love listening to all of the other wonderful presentations that take place and sharing ideas and really getting to know all of you. But alas, 2020 has been a very difficult year for us all. And being in New South Wales, of course, I am under effectively business lockdown. So what we're doing is we're presenting the presentation in this format, in a pre-recorded format. But don't worry, we're going to try and make it as interactive-ish as possible. So one of the things that we've done to help make this more interactive is set up a live chat capability. So point your mobile phone at that link or type in that email address onto your laptop and you should be able to have text chat with me during this if all goes well. This is the first time we've ever done this, so it's a bit of an experiment and I'm certainly hoping that it works. Fingers crossed. I'm going to set aside some time during the presentation for you to stop and reflect and take some notes. The other thing which I will also offer you right up front is a chance to take this presentation and take it into your organization. So we have of course been dealing with many organizations, our clients and others who are working their way through 2020 and all of what COVID and the lockdowns and the economic ramifications mean to their organizations. And we have a wealth of knowledge on how to manage this. The great news is some of that knowledge is actually not new. Some of it we've gleaned from previous recession work, from previous pandemic work, which I've been involved with in the Asia Pacific region. So there are options out there for us. So here's what I'm proposing. If you get some value out of today's session, just even with self-reflection, please feel free to contact us and we will rerun a similar session for you and your team to help get them back on track or help get them thinking new ways, or even just to help with morale. You can run these as a lunch session or as a breakfast briefing or whatever, but it's a great way of resetting and re-engaging many people who've been under a lot of stress lately. So please feel free to reach out to us and we're more than happy to offer that since we can't be here in person with you. So what's been some of the immediate ramifications of COVID on the Australian market? Well, obviously one of the first ones is that walk-in connections with the marketplace have really been limited. So there's been this huge demand for more digital services. We see evidence of this in many ways. We've actually seen in some cases websites of some of our clients actually fail to scale to meet the demand. We've seen some core systems also sometimes have ingress and egress problems as well. So there's physical, technical issues out there. But even more broadly as a society, we've seen internet traffic grow by roughly 21%, almost overnight. Now, luckily, we've had some good measures put in place to help us with that. But those are not necessarily going to remain, nor are they going to be sustainable without us fundamentally changing and rethinking some of our business models. Some people are saying that COVID-19 has sort of been spearheaded digital transformation. Not necessarily quite true. It certainly has spearheaded a massive move towards digitization. Processes are being digitized far faster now than ever before. They have to be. You can't do some of the processes, certainly some of the customer-facing processes in the way that we were before. But that's not the same thing as digital transformation, and I want to make a clear differentiation between those two things. Digitization is incredibly important. It's doing roughly the same thing in a digital manner, which will make it more efficient, more effective, and preferably, hopefully, faster, cheaper, and better. Digital transformation is when you actually work on the fundamentals of the organization itself. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? And so forth. And to a large degree, I would say that COVID has actually put a bit of a bottleneck on quite a lot of that for many organizations, if you take a look at the way that different organizations are starting to prioritize things. One of the other big trends that we've seen with COVID has been around this concept of governance, or specifically, is the governance that we currently have appropriate to meet, one, the emergency that we found ourselves in, but two, longer term. One of the number one inquiries that we saw, certainly in the first 3 weeks of the pandemic and the lockdown, was around the HR teams struggling with the human resources policies for working from home. Quite frankly, those policies were never developed for the scale, nor for this type of situation. More importantly, when you actually pared them back and looked at them, a lot of these governance processes that were put in place by HR to manage working from home were about protecting a certain set of principles in the organization. They were not actually about protecting the people per se, they were about protecting efficiency and effectiveness in the organization. Yet, when you looked at what we were trying to do with COVID and the working from home, it was actually about protecting people and, more importantly, protecting society at large. So we had this tension between two very different principles, foundations for the governance of working from home. Now, the smart organizations very quickly realized, yep, we'll manage by principle. We'll get people working from home. But there were many cases where real challenges emerged around competing governance principles. Now, one of the great things of that is now the dust has settled a bit. We're actually seeing that many organizations are now looking at their governance practices and they're thinking, are these practical going forward? There's actually been a reset. We have to actually come up with new governance principles. At the same time, we're also seeing that in the rush to get people working from home, there were some governance principles that we completely and utterly left in the dust. All of the challenges that we saw with Zoom and the security settings and so forth are a fine example of where that governance got left in the dust and now people are going back to look for it. The number 3 most read article from IBRS this year, the paper that we wrote, was actually the 5 things that you need to go back and retrofit around your Microsoft Teams governance. And I think people are now recognizing that they do need governance in the working from home model, in this new model, but it's to manage a different set of principles. So we could discuss that a great deal. Another thing that we have seen is that many organizations were caught off guard. They may have had a business continuity plan, but they didn't really have what I would call a business resilience plan. And we're going to explore that in more detail shortly. But hands up, who had a pandemic business continuity plan, or more specifically, a continuity group, a team that would take the reins on this? Who had one of those groups going into the pandemic? Raise your hand and look around the room. Okay. I would like you to think about, do you actually have one now? Whether or not you thought you had one going in or not, do you actually have a group of people now who are responsible for responding to any future changes in this pandemic, both positive and negative? Do you have a steering committee around that? What does that look like? And what is the IT department's footprint within that group? Have a little think about that for a second. What should that group look like if you don't have one? Or if you do have one, do you have the right sort of skill sets and the right scenario planning capabilities within that team? Is IT in that team in a way which is merely supportive, or are you actually leading the charge? Now you've had a little think about that. I want to come back to this. I want to bring this back. One of the things that we have seen with COVID and with being able to push through the governance issues and with having teams of people who could very rapidly make decisions, maybe they're permanent, maybe they're not, but one of the things that we saw is the destruction of myth. There were so many myths in how we would run our business and how IT would run the business. Things such as, oh no, we could never possibly roll out Dropbox because that would put us at grave risk, and we've got our own S drive storage. Well, very quickly we found, no, Dropbox is the way that you're going to get work done. Now, I'm just picking on Dropbox. I saw this with Teams, incidentally, Microsoft Teams. I saw it with a whole range of other collaborative tools, including Slack, tools and services that would never be deployed, could never be deployed because they breached X policy. Suddenly, they became possible. Another thing, how quickly can we develop an application, an e-form, a service record, public facing? We were able to deploy those in some cases within 3 or 4 days. I know one organization, they not only moved 8,000 staff to working from home, they also released a brand new product that was actually a constitution of multiple other products. They packaged them together specifically to help other organizations who are facing COVID and release it as a brand new product. And they did that in 3 days. Now, we look at that and we go, that's a myth. You could never release something. What about the quality control? Yes, you could do these things if you rethought the governance models and if you had the right steering group, if you had the right responsive mindset. Now, I think what we've seen emerge from COVID is 2 different types of organizational stance, of IT stance. One I'm going to call the reactive stance, and the other one I'm going to call the proactive stance. Now, those are not loaded terms. I know that many people think, reactive is bad, proactive is good. It's not the case here. They're just 2 different ways of approaching the challenge of COVID. In the reactive, you saw IT really taking charge and delivering what needed to get delivered quickly. It was all about winning hearts and getting the job done. Proactive was really where the organization spent a little bit more time working with the IT group leading and making sure that the rest of the business was brought along on some of the thinking. They not only won hearts, they won minds as well, so it was hearts and minds. Some organizations that proactive approach was absolutely terrific. In other organizations, that was always going to be a challenge and was always going to be problematic. And so the reactive was actually much better. So have a little think. Do you think that you were a reactive organization or were you a proactive organization? Have a little think about that, and then we'll take this forward a bit more. So let's take a look at how this landed for different organizations, and I want to use 2 different companies. We'll call them Company A and Company B because I'm highly original. Company A, this is a real company, they were in the middle, they're actually nearing the end of a proof of concept for remote working, and they're about 80% of the way through. They had a lot of the pilot projects were in place with head office staff, certainly with some of the technology staff. When the lockdown came along, of course, the senior executives, the CEO said, get it done, just get it done. And so what that meant is the IT department went into overdrive, as many of us did. Many long hours, a lot of closed door sessions within the IT department just on how to scale this up and how to get it working fast. And when they did hit road bumps, technical road bumps, they were resolved by, quite frankly, throwing money at the problem. If you've got a scalability issue, you throw money at it, you can scale up. In some cases, for example, this particular organization, they did not have a web-based, video-based collaboration tool. So they looked at the market, and of course, at that time, vendors were saying, here, have our video comms tools. They're free until September or whatever. So they grabbed those and they implemented them and so forth. The result was extremely strong. Within less than 2 weeks, they had everyone working from home. The staff were incredibly grateful because there was far less interruption in those first few weeks to staff than many organizations I think had feared. People are pretty good with coping with change. If the work doesn't change, just the location changes, then they're pretty good with it. The real challenges came a bit later as we started settling in, and that's a discussion for another day. But overall, the IT department was seen as champions. They have massive kudos. Yes, they spent quite a bit of cash. They also had to put the brakes on just for human capital wise on a whole bunch of projects, other projects that were planned. But here's the situation. They've got high reputation, they've had to defer some projects, but they got everything that needed to get done, and they did it fast and they did it well. Yes, they took some shortcuts that they now have to go back and fill. Their hope is that all of the goodwill that they have brought with them will now lend itself into the next budgeting cycle. So that when they go to the management and they say, we postponed all these projects, we've got this $300,000 video comms bill that we have to pay in September because we got this free software and now all the licenses are due. That's a real thing. They're hoping that they're going to be able to get that budget. Reality may be a little bit different from that hope, because we know that the economy, the global economy, is going to take a hammering, and that is going to have an impact on IT budgets locally. Let's look at scenario 2, the second company. They were in the middle of an upgrade. They were actually less advanced than company A in terms of their deployment of remote working. When they got the order to rush forward, they immediately called a war room. They got the executives in, and the IT department did not make the decisions on what projects were going to get postponed or what was going to be cut while they rushed forward with the working from home initiatives. That was left to the business, and there were some hard decisions that had to get made, but those were business decisions. Likewise, in those governance issues, they didn't set those solely within the IT department. They pushed those back onto the business, onto the HR teams. They got them involved in it, and others, which meant that the shortcuts that were made, for example, around risk and compliance on security issues and so forth, those were known risks, and the organization knows that those risks have to be remediated. They know that those projects which they have put a stake in the ground and held have to be started up again. And what's interesting is that just like Company A, great kudos, they're looking like gold, and everyone loves the IT department, but the business knows that there's a whole bunch of work that has yet to be restarted and done, or that there's shortcuts that need to be backfilled, and the business is prepared to put that into the budget. It's basically been locked into the next year's budget already. So the difference between the two is that by including the business and forcing the decisions back to the business, or at least getting them deeply involved in those decisions and those priorities, they've actually managed to secure the forward budget for IT. And we think that's going to be one of the big differentiators between how different organizations come out of the COVID cycle. So again, stop. Have a little think about how you approached your planning. And then have a think about how maybe that COVID planning, that COVID response is likely to affect your forward budget. Who is going to be backing you on those budget decisions? Have a little think about that for a second. So that's where we find ourselves now. What's next? So what? What do we do about this now? Well, I think the important thing is that we need to plan what's coming up next. And this sounds like it's going to be difficult because we do not know. I was still, even a couple of weeks ago, I was still hoping I was going to be able to come and meet with you all personally. Sorry. Lockdown again. Not going to happen. So we have to plan for an uncertain future, but there are some things that we know that we can do and that we have to do. One of those key areas is we need to go back and readdress some of the decisions we made for expediency that have actually opened up new risk profiles and actually take advantage in some ways of the new risk appetite that organizations have. There is a recognition that some of these things we feared are actually come with real benefits. So can't have people working from home. They might not work the right number of hours. No, actually they work more hours. That's what the data is showing us. And more importantly, they're more productive per hour. That's another interesting thing which is cropping up. Downside of that is they might be burning out. But again, a discussion for another day. I'm happy to go into the workplace ramifications. But one of the key risk areas that I have seen and I have been really crowing it from from every rooftop I can find, is that we can no longer use the network boundary or the organizational boundary to manage the protection of our content. Now, the notion of data leakage prevention for me now is almost ridiculous. We can't stop it. With the new collaboration tools that are being used both in working from home, and now that people have gotten used to them, they're coming back. They're going to be in the office, and they're going to be shared between agencies, between supplier and contractor, between central business, and it's just going to be a much bigger mesh ecosystem out there, which means your documents will be in the wind. We have to start managing information at what I call an object level. If you're in the Office 365 environment and you have not yet switched on Azure Information Protection Plan 1 or Plan 2, please go and take a look at it. You really need to be looking at this. Now, I'm not saying that we need this big, grand information management taxonomy or whatever. Quite the opposite. I'm just saying, by default, you should be thinking everything should be encrypted and protected. And then if it gets past the business, it doesn't matter. Now, I'm not saying it's as trivial as just flicking on a switch and making it all happen, but it doesn't have to be a huge project. But it is urgent, because we are starting to see not just data leakage, that's expected, but data being unprotected when it leaks. And that's a serious issue. It's only a matter of time before this really becomes a cropper. You do not want to be like some unnamed government department that left a filing cabinet of paper documents at the tip. And that's sort of what we're talking about here. It's the digital equivalent of that. So it's not a matter of only securing your workers, it's also a matter of securing all of the contractors' workers as well. So there needs to be a much greater ecosystem across Australia to protect all organisations. We're only as strong as the weakest link. And I think that we're going to see a lot of activity in this idea of increased security awareness, at the very least, right across the supply chain. Another thing which has been cropping up a lot in questions with us recently is, how do we manage the workforce in this new way? Can we monitor them? Now, the answer is yes. The new collaboration tools people are using monitors what they're doing in very, very, very fine detail, like how long they had a document open for and during what periods of time and who were they talking to when they were doing it. The level of detail we've got now on what people are doing has just skyrocketed. The question is, what do we do with that data? And should we be doing anything with it? My answer is, it's very, very useful information for understanding what's working. In other words, what tools are people really using that's making them effective? It's very, very bad if we then start applying that to trying rating who's the best person, the best performer, and so forth. We need to start managing not by time, which is how we actually did it for real in many office spaces. The last person in the office is always the one who's working hardest, and so forth. We're not even managing necessarily by output. This person is writing so many words a month or whatever. We need to be managing by outcome. Does this group's activities, and I do mean multiple people's activities, and it might be a group that exists beyond your organizational boundary, does this group's activities improve the organization's goals? Does it move us towards those goals more readily? And sometimes it's a quality issue, and sometimes that is genuinely an output and productivity issue. But we're going to have to get far smarter in how we manage. Now, what's interesting in Australia is the conversations I've had are really, really immature. They tend to be all around, I just want to monitor what people are doing. Well, that's a recipe for leading into union disasters. But in the United States, with the people I'm talking over there, they're looking and going, we really need to understand what's working with our workforce, because we know we're going to have to do a round of retrenchments, or more than one round of retrenchments. And it's not about finding who is the underperformer or whatever. It's about understanding what parts of the business don't move us towards the outcomes of the business. So this is life or death sort of stuff. And it is interesting that we've got very different perspectives here in Australia versus what we're seeing in the United States. Governance. I think we need to go back and really look at our governance as a whole. Too many governance activities are done by policy. You govern by policy. So if the policy says you can't do X, I'm sorry, you can't do X, even if the world has changed to Y. And I think the best organizations that came through this were the companies that went, we don't govern by policy, we govern by principle. So you need to get back to the principles that matter to the organization. Again, think of it as those outcomes that the organization is struggling towards, and you manage the governance around those. That gives you much more flexibility. So no matter what happens to the economy, what a COVID or going forward, you can be much more flexible in your response. And I think that's really important for us to rethink how we're governing. Budget constraints are coming. That's the reality. We are already seeing that impacting many of our clients. And that is, should not really have been expected, because in some ways, because they were well onto getting the budget set before COVID. That steam train was already in motion, and yet I think the challenge was that, like Company A and the story I talked about before, they had already spent a lot of that budget. They'd forward spent that budget because they had to react. Now, budget constraints in 2021 will be quite severe for many organizations. We know that. I would be hesitant in cutting some of the things that we've traditionally cut in the past. For example, cutting expertise from the top tiers, cutting innovation capabilities. Very, very dangerous to do that in a situation where you need to be flexible and agile. So be careful about those areas that you cut. The other part is, if you cut some things which you currently, for advisory services be one of those things, I have to say, bit of a self-promotion there. You cut those this year, you're not going to get them next year. And that will be the year. The coming year is the year where we really need to be getting back onto this transformation bit, because so much change is happening in the world economy. The last thing I'll say is that we need to really look at prioritizing our pipelines. What you give up now, as I was saying before, you're not going to get back. If you cut a project, it's not going to come back next year. You really need to be very careful about what assets, what resources, what types of people you're going to be cutting. And don't forget the backlog as well on that. There are things that you've deferred. Company B is a much better position because it was the business that made the decision to postpone, not cancel, not cut, postpone. And they know that there is a backlog of budget there that they have to now meet, or they have to make the hard decision that they are not going to do that thing that they said they were going to do. Business decision. So yeah, it's going to be a tough year. We do have some interesting materials around how to manage those budgets and manage those priorities with the business. So if you'd like to delve into that in more detail, please give me a call. I'll arrange to get a number of us. We've got some fantastic specialists in those areas, such as David Beale, Wissam, Sue Johnston, and so forth. If you're struggling with the working from home and the future of work and that dynamic between hybrid work and just all the new working models, please come and talk to me. I've been doing this for 20 years almost now, and it's funny to say, yay, it took a pandemic for some of my theories to be proven right, but it's there. It's terrible. I wish it wasn't the case. But we are here to help, and because we can't be there in person, we're more than happy to take calls from you and run some private, much more interactive and cozy sessions. The final thing I'd like to say is a big thank you to all of the team at BIAP, in particular Mags, John and Jamie. Running conferences at the best of times requires incredibly dedicated people, and people who really know how to get the best out of the entire community. They truly are amazing people. Doing that in the current situation with the lockdowns and all of the constant changes and disruptions requires not just amazing people, but amazingly amazing people. So John, Mags, Jamie, thank you so much for all of the work. I'd like to give you a big round of applause. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank the vendors who stuck by BIAP and really made all of this possible. Again, these conferences can't happen without vendor support. So as a favour to me, please go out into the floor and have a chat with those vendors. Make sure you're socially distanced, but do go and talk to them. They have great things to say. I will say that as soon as the lockdowns are lifted and I can travel again and get to see you all, I absolutely will be there with bells on. Thank you very much, and thank you from IBRS.